Well, thanks for that fine introduction, Larry. If I had known that I was like that much, I wouldn't have retired. I feel honored to have been invited by Dr. Kathy Castor to address this Doctoral Research Symposium, consisting, I think, of what I consider the next generation of young educators at a time when I am departing from a career of 50 years of teaching, 44 of which have been in higher education. So I've titled today's little talk, Growing a Soul for Social Justice. In her book, Writing to Change the World, Mary Pfeiffer wrote, the finest thing we can do in life is to grow a soul and then use it in the service of humankind. We writers, she wrote, may not live to see the changes that we work for, but readers will enjoy the shade of the trees we have planted. I think that is true also for educators. Many of you in this room today, of course, have taken the course that I've taught in the doctoral program for the last 20 years, and therefore know that in my special topic talks, I almost always do two things. First, I tell a story, and then second, I try to extract a truth or two from that story. And so the story I've chosen for this final talk at UNF is titled The Story of Snake Snyder. It's the story of how I think I first began to grow a soul for social justice when I was a small boy. I developed a child's sense of social justice, or at least injustice, by the time I was in the 4th grade. So I want to spend a few minutes just telling you how I came to develop a child's sense of justice. As many of you know, I grew up on a hardscrabble farm in Texas. I was born in 1939, and at a time when almost anyone who lived out in the country was poor. That is, poorer than many of the people who lived in towns. My students today just can't imagine the experiences that shaped the way I saw the world as a child. You know, I really did, almost like Abe Lincoln. I learned to read by the light of a kerosene lamp. That was because Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Rural Electric Authority, or the REA, simply hadn't come as far out into the country as I lived until I was in the 2nd grade. In those days, you know, you only bathed once a week. We had only an outdoor toilet, no indoor bathroom. We drew water by a bucket from a cistern in the ground. For heat in the winter, we had only one wood stove in a 5-room house with a kerosene cooking stove in the kitchen. The farmhouse was a single-wall structure and not very tightly built. I mean, the wind would often whistle through the cracks. And of course, the joke in those days was that at night in the winter, when one of those blue northers would blow down from the panhandle into central Texas while you were sleeping at night, it would just blow the cover off of you. I learned the social order by, I think, by the end of the 1st grade. At the top of the social order were the children of the bankers and the physicians and the attorneys and the businessmen who lived in town. Near the bottom of the social order were the kids like me, white children who lived in the country but whose parents owned land. And then also at the bottom of the social order, a little lower, were the poor white children whose families did not own land, many of whom lived in town across the railroad tracks. Of course, African Americans and Mexican Americans were at the very bottom of the social order, but there were only 2 such families. The children of those families were bused to the county seat, to a segregated school. In almost every little town in Texas, the wealthy and middle-class people lived on one side of the railroad tracks, and the poor people lived on the other side of the tracks. In the 1st through the 8th grades, I had a classmate named Snake Snyder, one of the poor kids who lived across the tracks. Snake Snyder's real name was Richard, but he preferred the nickname Snake. Snake fascinated me. You know, he had fiery red hair and more freckles than I'd ever seen on one person. Unlike so many other kids from across the tracks who seemed to slump with rounded shoulders, Snake walked with a strut, his shoulders thrown back and his chest out, and he had a swagger in his walk. Rightly so, I think, because I'm certain he could whip all the boys in the 1st grade, probably all the boys up through the 3rd grade, maybe some of the 4th grade boys. Snake was tough as a boot. He didn't seem to be afraid of anything or anyone, not even the teachers. He didn't cower in the face of the authority of the teachers. After all, by the end of the 1st week of the 1st grade, those of us who were poor and very poor already realized that we were treated differently from the children of the businessmen, the bankers, the doctors, the lawyers. We seemed to be treated with a noticeable contempt by most of the teachers. You know, we always felt like we were on trial, that we had to prove ourselves to be as worthy as the other kids. Of course, I set about trying to be worthy in the eyes of my teachers. You know, I wanted to be liked, even loved by my teachers, just like the more privileged town kids were loved. But not Snake. Snake seemed to be impervious to teacher approval. He seemed quite comfortable with who he was, whether or not the teachers liked him. As early as the 2nd grade, the image of a coiled rattlesnake, drawn in black ink, began to appear on Snake's belongings. First on his school notebook, then on his shoes. Before long, a coiled rattlesnake began to appear on the wall in the boys' bathroom. And then, every now and then, you'd see carved into the top of an occasional school desk a coiled rattlesnake. If you were doing something that Snake didn't like, you know, he would warn you to stop by shooting out his arm in a flash of speed with 2 fingers extended, as if his arm and 2 fingers were a rattlesnake striking at you. You know, it took until the 4th grade before the teachers and the principal almost broke a Snake. Prior to the 4th grade, I believe Snake had been punished what seemed to be countless times. He'd been kept in during recess and lunch. He'd been detained after school. He'd been paddled more than any other kid in school. Now, Mrs. Sneed was the 4th grade teacher. Mrs. Sneed was feared. Mrs. Sneed had the reputation of being the meanest teacher in the school. She was a no-nonsense teacher who seldom smiled. She was quite different from the other teachers. She wasn't like our 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade teachers who were somewhat affectionate and loving, especially to the children of the worthy families, and even to some of the poor children. Now, one day in Mrs. Sneed's 4th grade classroom, Joanne Henderson reported that $1 was missing from her purse. You have to understand that in the 1940s, $1 was a considerable amount of money. In fact, most of us felt lucky to have a dime or maybe 15 cents at most each day at school, usually tied in a knot in the corner of our handkerchief and then carried in our front pocket. Of course, if anyone were to have a whole $1 in school, it would be Joanne Henderson. Joanne's daddy, Mr. Joe Henderson, owned the only feed store in town and the largest grocery store in town. Joanne was from one of the most important in wealthy families. Of course, as you might expect, Joanne was pretty. And she wore pretty, carefully ironed, and usually ruffled dresses, often tied in the back with a big bow. Of course, she had the best penmanship in the whole class. All of her papers and artwork received gold stars and were thumbtacked on the classroom walls all around us. Well, just as soon as Joanne reported the missing dollar, Mrs. Sneed called out in her gruffest teacher voice, "Snake Snyder, come to the front of the room, please." And as Snake stood before Mrs. Sneed, asked, "Richard Snake Snyder, did you take $1 from Joanne's purse?" Snake replied, "No, ma'am." Mrs. Sneed asked again, "Snake Snyder, don't you lie to me. Did you steal Joanne's dollar?" Snake replied again, his head held high, "No, ma'am, I did not." Mrs. Sneed said, "Richard Snake Snyder, turn out your pockets." Well, you could hear a pin drop. It seemed like all the rest of the class was holding their breaths in unison as Snake reached in his pants pocket and pulled them out. Sure enough, the dollar fell to the floor. Mrs. Sneed snatched up the dollar and asked, "Did you take this dollar from Joanne's purse?" The Snake said, "No, ma'am. My daddy gave me that dollar this morning to buy a bucket of syrup to bring home this afternoon after school." Well, Snake pleaded, he begged. He said if he didn't come home with a bucket of syrup that afternoon or that dollar, his daddy would whip him. He said, "You have to believe me, Miss Sneed. My daddy gave me that dollar this morning." Well, it seemed like nothing that Snake said seemed to make a difference. After all, I guess Mrs. Sneed had already concluded, like others, that Snake from across the tracks was just going to grow up and steal your chickens anyway, just like his daddy did.